Hey everyone, welcome to Graphic Design. Today we're going to be talking a lot about some of the basics of graphic design, some terms and concepts that we'll be using all semester as we make smart decisions in the world of design. We're also going to be talking a lot about some theories that may come up over the course of the semester as you begin your projects. You know, a lot of people, when they think of graphic design, they want to just hop into Photoshop or Illustrator and start designing. And while you could do that, I think it's important to start with the basics, the foundation. And so let's start by defining graphic design. You see graphic design every day, thousands of designs, if not more than that. But chances are you probably don't think about that term as a definition very much. And so when you think about graphic design, we're going to talk about some things that it is and some things that it is not. Graphic design, as a term, graphic design was first coined in the year 1922 by a fellow by the name of William A. Dwiggins. William A. Dwiggins was a typeface designer and marketing expert, mostly doing a lot of book covers and actually creating new fonts, some of which we still use today. And he decided to call the work that he did in book publishing and in typefaces, he decided to call it graphic design. Now, that did not become a term that was used particularly in the American culture for many decades after that. But I got to give Dwiggins credit for at least coming up with that term. You know, when we think about graphic design, I think sometimes people think of it as being a term that's synonymous with art and a skill that's synonymous with art. And so while you will certainly need some artistic skill and talent to be a successful graphic designer, graphic design is not art in the traditional sense. It's not a painting by Da Vinci. It's not a painting by Van Gogh. It is not art in the traditional sense. And what I mean by that is the primary goal of most art is self-expression. Yes, you may find a buyer for that piece of art, that sculpture, that painting, that whatever, but typically you don't have a goal in mind other than to express yourself as an artist. You know, if you've ever been to an art show, either here on UC's campus or anywhere else in the world, and you've had a chance to talk to an artist, a lot of times what will happen is you will have an audience member, a viewer, ask the artist, hey, what did you mean by that painting? What does it mean? And oftentimes that artist will say, what do you think it means? What does it mean to you? And so art is kind of open to expression and open to your own interpretation. How you see a piece of art, like Mona Lisa, is completely different than how someone else might see it and interpret it. And often there is not one concrete message that the artist is trying to get across. That's very different from graphic design. Your main goal is not artistic expression. Your main goal is to communicate a message along the way. A graphic designer is going to work with clients to communicate a desired visual message to a target audience. And we'll talk about how that's important right now. One of the things that you will do most as a graphic designer is you will work with clients. You will work with people that hire you to create something for them, an album cover, a poster, a business card, a website. And typically they have as your client, they have a desired message they want to get across. And typically, though we always hope that our business, our nonprofit, our whatever reaches everybody, typically we're going to strive to reach a target audience, maybe a target demographic, whether that's a certain interest level, a certain age group, gender, some sort of demographic or psychographic. With graphic design, you're trying to reach a target audience. If we look at Ryan Hembree's basic model of communication in graphic design, he breaks it down in this very simple way, which I like. His little 3 circles. You have the sender, the encoder, and the receiver. as this little screen capture from a textbook says, for effective visual communication to occur, there must be a sender of a message, typically a client and a receiver such as the target audience. The graphic designer encodes the visual messages by translating the needs of the sender into the images and content that connect with the receiver. In other words, if you're an organization, let's say you're a theater group, well, obviously you want people to come to see the latest performance of your play. But typically, as a theater group, you would be, just as our example, very good at acting, but maybe not so good about marketing and advertising and graphic design. So you might hire a graphic designer to make a poster for your play. And as much as your play might be open to anyone or have the potential to be appreciated by anyone, typically there's a target audience in mind. So if you're a college theater company, you are mostly going to target college students to come see your play. And so who is the person that stands in between the organization and the target audience when it comes to visual communication? That is the graphic designer. They are the encoder, if I use the term from Hembree's model, but really they are kind of the bridge between the two. And to make sure that the client's message gets to the audience in a way they can understand and really appreciate it. You know, one thing I like about graphic design is it teaches us to not be selfish, to think about other people and their wants and needs. And so, just as an example, a few years ago, here at UC, there was a production of A Christmas Carol. Only this play was opening in late October, and so our client for this class wanted to make a poster for A Christmas Carol, and she wanted to emphasize kind of the dark, ghostly themes of A Christmas Carol. If you've seen any version of A Christmas Carol, it's filled with ghosts. Ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. Jacob Marley shows up as a ghost, etc. And so she wanted the poster to emphasize kind of the supernatural elements of the play because it was focusing on college students who had seen maybe a Mickey Mouse version or something like that along the years. So they would know this was a little more grown up of the Charles Dickens classic, a little more of a grown up version of that. But they also wanted to make sure that it was a suitable poster for A Christmas Carol, even though you were going to go see it around Halloween. One of the other things that client mentioned was to make sure that we did not use traditional Christmas colors, no red and green on the poster. And they wanted to make sure that it looked like a mature production of the play, that Tiny Tim, for example, was not emphasized, that we emphasized Scrooge and kind of the emotional and dynamic journey that character goes on. And so that's a lot of information to try to figure out how to translate to a graphic format, to a visual format with graphic design. And that was the challenge that my class had a few years ago, is to think about the client's needs, not their own personal self-expression, not to say, oh, but I love green. It doesn't matter that the client says no to green. I love it. You've got to think about what your client wants, and you've also got to help them understand how to best reach their target audience. That's really the work and the challenge of a graphic designer, because graphic design really is visual communication. More than anything else, graphic design is about sending a message. If we think of this advertisement, which is many years old now, back when Apple first released the iPhone, we have a magazine ad here. It says, "Touching is believing. The revolutionary new iPhone is now available." And it has someone's hand touching the screen and some branding for iPhone at the top right. That message is very clear. Now, it's kind of crazy for us to look back at it and see a phone being a touchscreen phone and thinking that that was once revolutionary, but it was. And that magazine advertisement is very clear about what made the iPhone different many years ago than the typical cell phone that a lot of people had. Let's look at a couple more definitions of graphic design real quick before we go on to some more information. According to the American Institute for Graphic Arts, graphic design is the combination of shapes, colors, typefaces, images, and/or words that visually communicate a message. If we look at the author of one of your textbooks, Timothy Samara, he defined graphic design this way: as the process of taking ideas and giving them a visual form so others can understand them. And there are two things in particular that I really, really like about that definition. The first one of those being that he describes it as a process. I think sometimes beginning designers sell themselves short, and at the other side of things, sometimes beginning graphic designers tend to be overly satisfied and too easily satisfied with their projects. Graphic design is a process. It is not something that you can finish in a span of a few minutes, and it's something that will take you quite some time to get a particular project to where you want it to be. The other part of this definition that I like is he made sure that not only do our ideas get a visual form, but he emphasized in his definition of the term that we understand the graphic design that we are looking at. And so it's ultimately a journey of being understood. As we move on to talk about some of the fundamentals of graphic design, I think it's important to consider things like line and color and shape. And so if we consider the line as a very basic form of design, and we can think about all the different ways that a line might occur visually, whether that's a wavy line, a squiggly line, a small, thin, straight line, a big, blocky, bold, thick line, a fancy, swirly line. Those things can actually help communicate meaning. Obviously, lines can be used to create very complex ideas, complex imagery. Lines can also be used in small, subtle ways. If we look at this visual for Ranchero Rosa Real Estate, this welcome sign, we can see that a line can be added to that design to organize the visual message, to organize the text, but also to emphasize the welcome part of that message. Lines can be used to divide layout, to make things easier to follow, to help your eyes flow through a message, whether that's looking at a hierarchy or something else. If we consider just these 4 lines on this screen here, we can see that they would not be suitable for every single design choice. But if you look at kind of the line with the rough, kind of worn edges, or if you look at the more swirly, curly line, you can probably think of products or instances where those might be worthwhile. If we look at this no parking, employees only sign, we can see a thin black line. But let's say people keep parking in the wrong parking spot, and we need to emphasize this information. We can change that line so it's a little bit thicker, it's in bright red, and suddenly the no parking sign looks a little bit more serious and a little bit more intimidating. We can also consider color. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the 1939 classic, The Wizard of Oz. When I had this class in person, most everyone has seen this, which is kind of amazing on its own, that we have all seen this film that's, now more than 80 years old. And I think one of the reasons why that film works is it goes from Dorothy in Kansas and being this kind of monotone, sepia-toned color scheme, and when Dorothy fully arrives in Oz, that's when the film changes to full Technicolor, and we see in that film how powerful color can be. And so color might be the most important choices that you make for a lot of the projects that you will do as a designer. Let's throw out some terms real quick. Hue is just another term, I should say, a synonym for the name of a color. So the hue of this paint swatch would be red. Then we can also, as we talk about color and use the terms designers might use or artists might use, we're going to look at the saturation of a color. So if we look at that image on the right and we look at the top of that box, we can see that the top of that box is a bright, intense red. It is typically what you think of when you think of the color red being in perhaps a box of crayons. If we go kind of down that box as the red gets more and more washed out, less intense, less saturated, until the point that it's almost completely gray, we can see that as a desaturated image. And so it's important to consider how saturated the hue of the color that you pick is. Now, you are probably used to Instagram filters and some of these choices, but it's important that we make these decisions along the way that best serve the images, text, shapes, or photography in our designs. So let's look at these two examples side by side. We have two surfers. Which image would you say is more saturated? The one on the right, because the colors are more vibrant, less washed out, less grayed out. And as we think of color, there's all sorts of color theories that we could think about, and we could go really, really in depth into color theory. But for example, we could choose a monochromatic color scheme as a designer. If we choose a monochromatic color scheme, all we're doing is picking one color from the beautiful color wheel, and we're going to choose different shades or variations of that color. Maybe not 50 of them, but a lot of shades. And so if we look at a monochromatic red, we know that that's going to work in just about every design choice, because some different shades of red are not going to clash with each other. The same with blue or any other color that we chose on the color wheel. We can also choose colors that are close together on the color wheel. Warm colors like red and orange and yellow will give us a certain mood and a certain tone. In the same way, if we choose cooler colors like blues and greens, that works very well as a designer. One thing that you'll probably play a lot around with, though, is complementary colors. And why are these colors complementary? Because if we look at the color wheel, these colors are typically directly across from each other on the color wheel. And so we see, for example, blue across from orange. We see red across from green, and so on. And these colors give us high contrast imagery, and because these colors complement each other but are high contrast, they are used a lot in advertising and marketing, especially in the entertainment industry. You know, we look at most movie posters, especially the big budget blockbuster kind of movies, whether that is Wonder Woman or Transformers or Blade Runner or whatever, we see complementary colors used often. And that's because, just in case you're wondering, they are very vibrant and eye-catching, but also they're known to work well. Now you might be asking, but what about blue and orange in particular works? Well, research tends to show that purple and yellow is often seen as completely feminine to a lot of audience members, at least here in America. And then red and green work really great together, but tend to scream Christmas, for better or for worse. And so that kind of leaves shades of blue and shades of orange to work together. And so as you start to look at movie posters or maybe even some artwork that Netflix chooses, if they're choosing something that's based on the poster, it will often have a complementary color scheme. And there are all sorts of other color formulas that we can talk about, and we will over the course of this next semester. One thing that's especially important for a graphic designer that might not be as important for, let's say, a painter is readability. I would encourage you all semester to keep thinking about readability. If you can't read the words that are on your design, then it doesn't really matter how beautiful it is. You messed up somewhere along the way. So if we look at this example from the In Bloom Annual Conservation Conference, we can see that if we make the shade of blue a little bit darker in the background, that makes the white text and yellow text pop kind of from the background and become easier to read. Readability is always going to be important. Type is only type when it's friendly. It's also important to think about that every color sends a message. If you look at the color red and look at the color red for long enough, how does it make you feel? Or at least how is it supposed to make you feel? Red will typically be used to communicate intensity, anger, love, very strong, bold feelings. Red also communicates a lot of energy and a lot of warmth. This is why, for example, in a lot of logo design, especially for food, and I'm not trying to make anybody hungry right now, but for fast food, most every logo that you can think of, whether that's Wendy's or McDonald's or Chick-fil-A or whoever, has the color red because typically you want warmth to be associated with the meal that you're picking up from a restaurant. If we consider the color blue, blue is used in graphic design often to communicate trust. Blue is a very calming, assuring color. And so we see especially a lot of large, giant corporations like Walmart. We see a lot of tech companies like IBM and Dell. We see a lot of financial institutions, banks, and so forth using the color blue because there's a lot of trust involved, especially, for example, with banking. And then if we think about the color green, just as an example, green is typically used in graphic design to communicate growth and to communicate things that are associated with the environment. It's a very caring color. And so if you're looking at the Girl Scout logo, if you're looking at some things that Animal Planet has published, you will see a lot of green used along the way. Now let's look at this shade of pink. Just stare at it for a second. I'll give you a minute. How does it make you feel? Would you say that it makes you feel violent and aggressive? Or does it make you kind of feel calm and subdued? Well, an NYU professor by the name of Adam Alter wrote a book about this shade of pink and some other colors in a book that's really focused on color theory called Drunk Tank Pink, which is the same name of this particular shade of pink. Long story short, though I would recommend the book if you want to check it out, is a lot of schools and especially a lot of prisons had been experimenting with what color could they paint the classroom, and obviously in the prison settings, what color could they paint the jail cells to make the prisoners be a little more calm, a little less intense, a little more open to suggestion from their superiors. And Drunk Tank Pink is something that has been shown as a color to shape how we think, feel, and behave. And the prisoners that have been placed in Drunk Tank Pink cells tend to be better behaved than those in other cells. I've always heard an urban legend that some college football teams tried painting the opposing locker room in Drunk Tank Pink, but I can't quite confirm that. Anyway, so thinking about color theory and thinking about what colors work together, you want to make sure not only do the colors work together, not only do they help your text become readable, but also they need to be suitable for your business. If you're a fashion studio or a hair salon, having, I think, a colorful business card is very smart. If you're a senior accounting analyst for a giant Fortune 500 company, maybe your overall business card doesn't need to look wacky and crazy. Maybe you're going to go, in this example, with something a little more subtle, a little less saturated, a little more serious along the way. Some other things to consider when you're thinking about design: you want to consider both shape and space. Because when we combine text and color and shape and space, as you can see here, we can make a lot of different images look iconic and different. I mean, look at these logos. Anyway, you guys know shape: circle, square, triangle. But as you begin playing around in Adobe software, in particular, playing around with Illustrator, you will see how shapes can make up signs and even some more complex imagery. Shapes are very important to us as a color. Let me try that again. Shapes are very important to us as a culture, and so is color. So if we look at the stop sign, for example, yes, it says stop. Yes, it is red, so we think we might stop. But also it works as an octagon. It's the only road sign that is that shape. So even when you're driving around, shapes help communicate meaning. If you look at this instructions for Classic Sun Tea, it's very dull, without any color, without any shapes or graphics. You'll notice just by adding circles around the numbers, a square, and a beige rectangle, suddenly this becomes much more interesting to look at. Shapes do not always have to be complex to be meaningful, though certainly, as you can see with this little tea cup, tea glass, you can do some really fun, memorable things with simple shapes. Spacing is also important. We tend to associate things that are close together visually as things that belong together. If all these squares are the same size and the same distance apart, I don't know visually which one is the most important. If one is bigger and maybe set apart from the others, you tend to notice it more. Let's talk about this business card for a jewelry store owner/designer. It looks okay, but let's talk about how we can make it better. One thing that we can do is we notice that pretty much all the text outside of the logo is the same size. And if everything is the same size, the same proportions, again, we don't know what's important. If you walk into a room and there's a giant banner and a tiny flyer the size of your hand, chances are you're going to notice the banner first. And graphic design works the same way, even if you're working on something very small, like a business card. So for this business card, I would suggest, for example, making the name of the business card owner bigger than everything else and setting that apart visually by giving it some space from the address and phone number. We can look at, for example, the FedEx logo and see a lot of space. So if you look at FedEx, how many of you have noticed the arrow between the E and the X before? And then you want to ask yourself, is that a coincidence? Of course not. The E and the X were placed that way strategically by a designer who wanted to visually share a meaningful message. So, the arrow's pointing right, because when you mail something, when you FedEx something, you not only want your package, your envelope, your whatever to be in motion, you want it to be moving in the right direction. And through space and creative use of color and typography, it does that. We can look at the Baskin-Robbins logo, which uses color and space, not just to give us a BR abbreviation for the company, but a pink 31 mixed in there with the typography. Or we can look at the Tostitos logo, which actually includes two people sharing chips and salsa, the only two things that I think Tostitos makes. There's a lot of meaning communicated by color, font choice, and simple shapes. Speaking of font choice, let's close today by looking at typography. And it's always important to consider typography, whether that's Courier New or Helvetica, or in this case, Papyrus. You probably don't give much thought when you sit down to read a book or scroll through a website or maybe flip through a magazine about the font choices that are there. But someone has made every font choice that you look at, both in print and online, both on the stop sign that you pass by, the bumper sticker that you're angry at, and even on the box of cereal you might have had for breakfast. Now, when I talk about typography as a term, we just define that as the style or appearance of text. Now, there are a lot of things that can influence typography and how your words might look like on a page or in a digital format. One of those things is simply the point size of your text. I know for a lot of classes here at UC, you have to write a paper or maybe an essay, and your instructor, your professor, has probably told you that it has to be 12-point font. Well, what in the world does that mean? A point is simply a precise measurement of text, and in theory, most fonts, at least when they were originally designed, were created so that a 72-point font is a 1-inch height of printed text. You know, if we took this class, let's say 30 years ago, and we didn't have Photoshop, we didn't have InDesign, we would have a special ruler that was included in your course items called a pica pole. And it would be to measure any typefaces that you're going to use. 12 points in a pica, 12 picas an inch. Are you confused? Maybe so. But just know, when you choose how many points your paper is when you're writing it, or what point size your font will be on the poster that you design, know that you're really choosing the size of that text in a very precise way. We also have a huge number of different categories of types called serif or sans serif fonts. There are all sorts of different types of fonts, but ultimately we can narrow our fonts down to two different types of fonts: serif, like I said, or sans serif. Serif fonts are fonts that have kind of fancy detailed brush strokes at the end of most characters. For example, Times New Roman tends to be a serif font. When you're looking at, let's say, a magazine, for example, anything that has a block of text in it, anything that you're reading in paragraph form, especially in print, tends to be a serif font. We tend to read small serif fonts a little bit easier in print because of these details. The other type of font, if we were to oversimplify fonts and put them into two categories, the other category would be sans serif. So serif and sans serif. What is a sans serif font? Well, if a serif font has fancy brushstrokes at the end of most characters, a sans serif font does not have those fancy details at the end of most characters. They are eliminated. Sans being, from my very limited knowledge of French, the French word for without. So sans serif fonts, even Comic Sans, are really just without the serifs, without these details. And sans serif fonts are used primarily in a digital format, used primarily for online publishing. So if you're looking at a blog, you're looking at a BuzzFeed article, you're scrolling through something on your phone or on your laptop, chances are, if it's online, if it's digital first, then it's going to be a sans serif font. So if we look at this example here, is this a serif or a sans serif font? Go ahead, tell me. Ah, that's right, it's a serif font. What makes it a serif font? Those little details on the end. Now there are all sorts of other types of fonts, script fonts and black letter fonts, novelty fonts that we will try to shy away from for the most part. Most every font that you choose will fall into one of those two categories, and they are actually probably best used together. If we look at this slide here from Emerging Technologies, the Future of Bioscience, we can see that a novelty font might be fun to share with your friends, but typically tends to look very unprofessional. We'll spend a lot of time this semester on dafont.com choosing fonts for you to use to customize your various projects, and rookie designers tend to choose a lot of novelty fonts, things that look like fire or doodles or whatever. And typically that's not going to be your best choice as a professional designer. If we were to change this Emerging Technologies Future of Bioscience slide to something that looks a little less hand-drawn, a little more serious, we have a tall, bold, yet thin font. It communicates the meaning that probably a lecture about bioscience is intended to communicate. The fonts you choose matters. If we look at this meme, it's not really a meme, but we'll call it that. You can look at a note that says, "I will always find you," that has hearts to dot the I's, and that looks kind of sweet, kind of cute. Or you have this one that looks kind of scribbled in blood using a knife that says, "I will always find you." The words say the same thing, but how the font looks really helps communicate the message, for better or for worse. If we look at a couple examples here, we can see the difference between a serif font and a sans serif font looks like when you are planning the layout of a page. Because ultimately, opposites attract. Maybe not in life, but certainly in design. We tend to like a bold font next to a light font. We tend to like a headline or a chapter title that's written in a sans serif font, and a paragraph that's written in a serif font. Because everyone who's looking at a design is looking at it through a hierarchy. Here in the West, we're looking at things top to bottom, left to right. And how we choose our fonts and how we organize them in our design will impact how the reader's eyes are guided. Hierarchy is used to guide the reader's eye to whatever is the most important. Again, we'll look at another quick business card example. Can you read web designer? And we've got some kind of icons on the right. If we make the smallest subtle change and make her name and the words web designer a little bigger than her email address or website or phone number, suddenly that stands out. We remember her name and what she does a little bit better. If we go one step further and we add some color, we add some distinctive and contrasting fonts, suddenly Can You Read web designer kind of hops off the page a little bit more, and it helps not only her look professional, but helps this design be easier to follow, because what's most important? What she does and what her name is. What's less important? Her phone number. There you go. If we look at this font that says "Get Noticed, Social Media for Small Businesses and Entrepreneurs." What if we made some changes to this? How could we make this better? And let's say we have to stick with that really ugly yellow color. If we make "Get Noticed" really big, suddenly this presentation looks like the person that's about to give it knows what they're talking about, because they've chosen some effective fonts. As you think about design, consider all these things we've talked about today. line, typography, color, shape, space, and so on. And know that it's all there to communicate meaning. But it's also there to hopefully help your design stand out from everyone else's. If we look at this example, we can see that Helvetica, a typeface that was created around 50 years ago to be contemporary and new, is still the most used font for logo design. And so if you design a logo, and you will in this class later this semester, it's best not to choose, for example, Helvetica, because it's been used a lot. It's a very common choice. Everything from Post-it to North Face to Tupperware uses Helvetica. And so in addition to making smart choices with color and typography and shape and organization and so forth, you've also got to try to figure out how to make your design stand out from everyone else's. And I think that's going to come with a lot of practice, and it'll come with time. But if we look at this real ad that the city of Los Angeles put out looking for a graphic designer, it's memorable because it's unique, it's really funny, but it also communicates the exact meaning that they're looking for. And so that's ultimately your challenge, is to use these basic concepts to create something that's unique, meaningful, and that, yes, creates the message that you're going for, that you're trying to send as a graphic designer from your client to your target audience. With all that being said, thank you for listening and watching this video. If you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks for playing along with our introduction to the fundamentals of graphic design.